God keeps putting on me the book of Esther, so I've already read it by myself, but I really want to read it with you because a lot of what he's talking about here and showing me are things that he has told me he's going to do. And he's been talking with me about this for several months, probably about 6 or 7 months, about a judgment that he's going to bring in which the plans of the enemy are going to be switched. The plans of the enemy will come on his own head, and he's going to raise up a taunt against those who've been oppressing his people. Now, don't misunderstand, this isn't the time of the end in which God's people are going to flourish and prosper and the kingdom will be restored to them. I just want you to understand it as a time of encouragement for God's actual people, and you better make sure that you're his actual people. Let me tell you what his actual people are: those who hear the message and put it into practice. For those who have not been doing that, they're actually going to be included in this judgment. So all of those things that people have been putting their hope in, the refuge that they've been hiding out in, the lie that they've been hiding out in, that's going to be brought on their own heads. The only people who are going to actually benefit from this judgment that God is going to bring are those who have truly been putting his commands and his covenant into practice. So that's all that I'm going to say about that, because if I say any more, people start trying to pick this up by the work of their own hands, and God hasn't told me to say any more. So, when God is talking with you, you have to discern with him whether this is something that he wants you to share, what parts of this he wants you to share with other people, and what parts of this are for you. I have shared more with those who put this into practice, with those who come to Sabbath and actually put this into practice. I'm not going to share more with other people. They're going to try to pick it up by the work of their own hands. And most of the time what happens with wicked people is that they hear these things and they think, oh, these promises are for me. If you're not showing up and you're not putting this into practice, these promises are not for you. The only promise that is for you is the judgment. So he's been bringing me to Esther today and having me read this to give me encouragement that he is going to be bringing the plans of the enemy on his own head, and that he's going to raise up a taunt against the wicked who were devising evil schemes against God's people and trying to oppress them. He's going to bring judgment against those who've been doing that. This is also going to affect those who have been trusting in the things of the world, their bank accounts, their 401ks, their stuff, and they're going to be freaked out by it. That's all I'm going to say. Let's read Esther. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Sometimes you might hear this king referred to as Ahasuerus. That's the Hebrew form of Xerxes, so shouldn't confuse you, same person. The Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces, were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden and hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material, to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of the law and justice, He spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Medes, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Okay, I just want to say one thing. I don't care if you're a man or a woman, you have the same covenant with God. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking, God loves men more than women, and so men get to treat women however they want, or if you're a woman looking at this and you're like, God hates women, that's not what's being represented here. Whether you're a man or a woman here on earth, there is no male or female in the kingdom of heaven. And so you have to understand that we have the same covenant, and that actually the king's behavior towards a woman or the king's position towards a woman is representative of our king, of God towards his bride. Again, doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, here right now, your position towards God is the same. And so if you take your earthly position and you think that you can lord it over someone because right now you're a man, that's not going to work very well with God. And if you as a woman think, well, I'm going to go hide out in my husband's covenant and he's going to bear the covenant for me because he's supposed to be this male leader and he's supposed to, do blah, blah, blah. He has a greater covenant than I do. It's not going to work very well with God. And I'm telling you that because I see a lot of women doing that, especially pastors' wives. Their whole identity is, I'm a pastor's wife. Doesn't matter that the pastor's leading you all the way to hell and you have a certain feeling inside of you that what he's saying is not true. You're not going to say anything because he's the man. That isn't biblical, guys. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that a husband submits to a wife just the same as a wife submits to a husband. The Bible gives certain roles and responsibilities to people. How is that responsibility? How are either of those positions responsibility? Lording over or submitting without having any kind of accountability whatsoever? Just turning a blind eye to falsehood? No. That's not what's meant in the Bible. That's what's pitched in counterfeit Christianity, but that's not what's meant in the Bible. So I do want you to pay attention to that as we're reading this. When God summons you, you come. I also want you to notice as we go into the story that Esther didn't just sit idly by and was like, I don't have any role here, because the king is going to kill me if I go and approach him. No, she went to the King of Kings and she humbled herself and fasted for 3 days. And then she did what she was supposed to do according to her allegiance to him, to God, before anyone else. And by the grace and mercy of God, he spared her life. But she did what she was supposed to do, even on the penalty of death. No one's going to hide. All right, so Memucan is proposing this plan to King Xerxes or Ahasuerus. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Hear that, everyone. If you don't please the king, you don't respect him, you don't respond to him, you don't submit to him, your position will be given to someone better than you. Jesus talked about that. Those who were inside the kingdom, who didn't want to come to the wedding banquet, their invitation was revoked, and God went out, or sent his servants out, or the master sends his servants out to those on the street and invites them into the wedding banquet. Happened with native-born Israelites. It can happen with you too. Can't be bothered to pick up your covenant. Can't be bothered to put into practice what God has told you must do. You'll listen to it all day like it's a pretty song or something, but don't put it into practice. Your royal position will be given to someone who is better than you. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in his own script, and to his own people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. This is not an edict for exploitation. That's not how it's being used in Scripture. That is an edict of representation. It is an edict and a sign of your relationship with your husband, with your number one husband, which is Jesus. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Okay? Virgins, sign of purity. That's what's being represented in Scripture. Don't be focused on the carnal. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Okay, beauty treatments, so they have to be prepared in order to go before the king. Do you need to be prepared before you go before your king? What's beautiful to God? Does he care about oil and myrrh? Does he care about all of that? No, he cares about your heart. You have to become beautiful to God. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for women, 6 months with the oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem, to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Now, I want to point something out here. There was a movie that I used to watch that was supposedly based on the book of Esther, and I used to watch this when I first was drawn to Christ, and he still had to take things out of me, like watching movies and watching shows, and especially based, supposedly based on the Bible. Because even if it's word for word, and there was a movie that I used to watch that was verbatim, I think it was the ESV version or translation of the Bible. The problem is that there are other ways of communicating and other things that you can insert and add to the scroll. It's hard enough to read the Bible and you still have intonations and inflections and attitudes and things like that come out when you're reading the word. But when you are watching a Hollywood production, first of all, that's sort of an oxymoron, like a Hollywood production. So Hollywood is teaching you about the Bible. That's kind of scary. But when you're watching something like this, you have now the inflections and intonations and behaviors and attitudes and postures that are being reflected of each character, namely Jesus. And I remember that I had watched that movie a thousand times because it was really like God had shrunk me down from watching anything. So it was like the only thing that I felt like I could watch. And now he was rooting this out of me. And he did it based on one scene. And it was the scene where Jesus is saying, I'm the bread of life, but he's like screaming it at them. Not Jesus. Excuse me. Let me make sure that I'm being clear about this. The character portraying Jesus is screaming it at people. I am the bread of life. And I thought, Isaiah talks about Jesus and he says that he didn't raise a cry in the street. A bruised reed he did not break. He wasn't this like aggressive, gonna shove it down your throat kind of character. So what is this? The people, started rejecting the message, but they were rejecting the message. And the movie is sort of implying that they're rejecting the message in part because of the way he's portraying the message. So that was the end of watching anything at all. Now, when I used to watch this movie on supposedly on the Book of Esther, there's this portrayal that what's happening here is that these women are going in and sleeping with the king. Like this is, The Bachelor or something. Guys, in verse 19, it says, when the virgins were assembled a second time, it wouldn't be referring to them as the virgins anymore if they had gone in and slept with the king. This says nothing about them going in and sleeping with the king and the king being pleased with them based on whether or not they were good in bed. You can be pleased with someone without sleeping with them. So this is a total perversion and distortion of what was actually going on. And to be honest, it's pretty sick. I mean, this interpretation is modeled after the world. And I'll tell you something else is that the only reason I know that about The Bachelor, by the way, because I never used to watch The Bachelor. I never watched that show. I learned about that show. I watched that show with a group of women who were trying to get me to go to their church. A group of so-called Christian women, pastors' wives, who got together once a week for a potluck and gossiped about who they liked and hated on The Bachelor. And I kind of tolerated it for a while until the very end of The Bachelor, where The Bachelor actually goes in and sleeps with these different women. That is disgusting. And I was pagan at the time and couldn't tolerate this. These were so-called Christian women trying to bring me in on what premise? You can have the world in Christ too? I mean, what are we doing here? We have a double-minded identity? That is filthy. That is disgusting to entertain yourself with stuff like that. Listen to my story. Listen to my testimony. When Christ drew me to himself, he rooted out so-called biblical shows, telling me this is not a representation of me. So that's not a correct interpretation of this book. And also, set a good example, or don't even put that out there. Don't even put that out there that you're Christian. Because every time we put that out there, we are responsible for representing the image of Christ. And unfortunately, a lot of people who have misrepresented the image of Christ are the reason why certain people in the world don't want anything to do with Christians. Because they associate counterfeit Christianity with Christianity. It's really unfortunate and disgusting that there's a mass group of people calling themselves Christian who are supporting genocide, who are saying, finish them, and are worshiping this image of counterfeit Israel. Never mind that they are sodomizing and raping and torturing prisoners. I don't really care what you think about Muslims or any other group. I don't care if you think that they're terrorists. That is not what God's chosen people do. God's people are commanded not to murder, steal, rape, sodomize, lie, or use his name in vain. And so when you are saying that you are Christian and you are misrepresenting him, you are using his name in vain. Please understand that. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded them concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate." Are we supposed to keep ourselves separate? You betcha. "Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews. I just want to point something out here, by the way. This context of destroy has to mean something different from kill. Otherwise, it wouldn't say destroy, kill, and annihilate. Well, let's keep our eye on it, because kill and annihilate, I would say, is probably the same thing. But there's another context that makes me wonder about what that actually means. I'll show it to you when we get there. So dispatches were sent by courier to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, men, women, and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on, instead of sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Okay, I don't want to pause right there. So she sent clothes for him to put on instead of sackcloth, so that he could come into the gates and he could speak with her, but he would not accept them. Why? In part, we can understand that the reason why Mordecai put on sackcloth is because he's mourning before God. That's what Jews did. That's what God said. Weep, wail, mourn, lament, put on sackcloth and ashes. Turn from your wicked ways. Humble yourselves before me and I will restore you. So that's what he's doing right now. While Mordecai is sending word to Esther, he's not submitting to Esther as his God. He's submitting to God there. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that they must be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter to them and spares their lives. but 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish." Okay, look at his posture towards Esther. He's not saying, "Esther, you are the one who's going to do this." He does say, "And who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this." But he's not submitting to Esther as his God. Like, "You're going to change this for us. You're going to do this. It's in your power." He's not doing that. He's saying, God will destroy your family if you don't walk in the authority you've been given. But God is going to spare his people. Deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place because God is going to do that because we're his people. But you, even being a Jew, you'll be destroyed. Okay, so it's important to understand this because a lot of times we set up idols and then we say, "Oh, God's going to do this through you." And we don't even realize that we're setting up that idol. Who is that our job to say what God is going to do? Look at the position of Mordecai. And so I try to correct you guys all the time and make sure that you're not setting me up in that way. You don't get to say, "Oh, let me go listen to Carrie today so that I can hear the word of the Lord." You've been given the Spirit of God. What do I do with you? Am I here to replace God? No. I'm here to share my testimony and to shepherd you back to God. That's all I do. I don't have power to change my own situation. I'm sitting here fasting, waiting for God to do what he's going to do for me because he's promised to take care of me. So don't mistakenly set me up as an idol, guys. Make sure that your position with regard to human beings is correct. Make sure that you know who your God is. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her. Now, can you imagine that moment? You imagine being Queen Esther walking up and wondering, "I'm either going to be killed or he's going to receive me. Which is it going to be?" When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, thank God, and held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do as Esther asked." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." You know, I'm kind of struck by, a lot of times we think "Oh, we're so civilized now," right? We think, "Oh, we engage in much more moral behavior." Look at his behavior towards his wife. Even up to half the kingdom. And by the way, this is a pagan kingdom, guys. This is Medo-Persia. Is this how God's people behave towards their wives? Are those calling themselves God's people? No, they just go find another one, don't they? And before you say that that's what he did with Vashti, Vashti dishonored him. So there was a different stipulation within their law, but this is a law-abiding person who is honoring his wife. Haman went out that day, happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zedesh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to the company to accompany the king to the banquet she gave." Little does he know. "And she invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." His wife Zedesh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had a pole set up. Now I want to show you what God does. No sooner does this plan go into effect, do you see behind the scenes what God is doing. And we can see this right now. We can see this in his scriptures, that he's doing something behind the scenes. But in your own life, does that translate? Do you believe that God is doing something behind the scenes right now in your situation? Because I do. I believe that God has a plan and that he knows how he's building me right now, even in this absence of me knowing what he's doing and what he's going to do to rescue me. That night, the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. Look at that, guys. Right at the moment that Haman is going in to talk with King Xerxes about impaling Mordecai, God has put it on the heart of the king to honor Mordecai. So the plan of the enemy is already starting to be placed on his own head. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king is worn and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Okay, well, who is one of the king's most noble princes? I mean, he already set up Haman as being his right-hand man. So guess who gets to do this? For his enemy. I think this is hilarious. It's such sweet vindication. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him back on horseback throughout the streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. How humiliating. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zedesh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zedesh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Now, Zedesh knows that Mordecai, who he has set himself against, is of Jewish origin. He has not yet learned that Esther is Mordecai's cousin, and Esther is also of Jewish origin. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. And just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, set a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. This same language, by the way, is used to describe what happens with God. I want to show you something in Zechariah 6. Because, there's this whole narrative in counterfeit Christianity that God doesn't punish and, God can't be tempted by evil. But don't lean on your own understanding about what evil is. You have to destroy evil, or not you. God has to destroy evil. Actually, that's not your right. And so if he's righteous, he has to do away with evil. Look what it says in Zechariah 6. I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots coming out from between the 2 mountains, mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, the fourth dappled, all of them powerful. I asked the angel who was speaking to me, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel answered me, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. The one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, and the one with the dappled horses going towards the south." When the powerful horses went out, they were straining to go throughout the earth, and he said, "Go throughout the earth." So they went throughout the earth. Then he called to me, "Look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north." Now that's the NIV version. What you need to understand is that in the previous chapter, he's upset. God is upset because he has sent these horses out, and they came back and reported to him. I'm sorry, not in the previous chapter, it's in chapter 1. He sends these chariots out, and they come back and report to him that they found the whole world at rest and in peace. And then the angel of the Lord said, "Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with these 70 years? So the Lord spoke kind and comforting words to the angel who talked with me. And then the angel who was speaking to me said, "Proclaim this word. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I'm very jealous for Jerusalem and Zion, and I'm angry with the nations that feel secure. I was only a little angry, but they went too far with the punishment." So this is why he's sending these other horses out. And you learn about those other horses in Revelation 6, in the seals of Revelation. And so when it says right here, you understand that he's sending wrath. And then it says, "Look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north." What does that mean? Let me tell you what it means. Let me tell you the better translation of this passage in the NASB. Now, I'm not saying that the NASB is the better translation in general. All translations have problems. But in this specific case, this is the better translation. "Then he called out to me and spoke to me, saying, See, those who are going to the land of the north have appeased my wrath in the land of the north." Have appeased my wrath in the land of the north. Now, what does it say right here? The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and then the king's fury subsided. You know, when you feel wrath or angst, and then there's an appropriate response to that, then your fury subsides. Then your wrath is appeased. Destruction of evil is an appropriate response for the one who is entitled to destroy evil, not to those stupid, dull-minded people who think that they're going to physically kill anyone who disagrees with them and thinks that's somehow biblical. We're not talking about that. Vindication belongs to God. So the symbolism is just really uncanny here in this book of Esther. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told him how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Do you see that? Everything that belonged to the enemy was given to God's people. Esther pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she rose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see this disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, "I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name, in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." Okay, you hear that? That was the law of the Medes and Persians, that anything that was written could not, or sealed with the signet ring, could not be revoked. So what needed to happen, and by the way, anything that God has established is not revoked, is it? What needed to happen here is something needed to go into effect that allowed a counter response. Not even the king is allowed to revoke what has been established with that signet ring. Okay, so don't think that any other story is going to be told If you want to understand your covenant, you want to know what's going to happen, you go to the word, because the word is forever. None of these words are going to pass away. Everything written here is what's going to happen, is what is required. Nothing will be changed. At once, the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses especially bred for the king. By the way, God has told you that if you're a faithful servant, he's going to set you over his house. And that's what's being represented here with Mordecai. Mordecai has been a faithful servant. He's got the king's signet ring. You're not going to rise above Jesus, but you'll be set over his house, under Jesus. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and their children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Okay, that's the day that was called for the annihilation of the Jews. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, riding the royal horses, went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. Boy, God's really elevated him from crying outside the gates in sackcloth, hasn't he? How the tables have turned. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. Oh, can we read that again? And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. Oh, so being a Jew is not actually contingent on nationality. Interesting. And as Paul said, being a Jew is the basis for being a Jew is circumcision of the heart. Has nothing to do with ethnicity, has nothing to do with descent. It is an issue of being in the covenant. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now their tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of the other nationalities were afraid of them, and all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. Okay, we're going to look at the OJB version right here for Esther 9:5, because there's a couple things that I want to show you here. One is what I mentioned earlier with regard to destroy, and the other has to do with doing what they pleased to those who hated them. I don't know that that's the right translation. I mean, that's kind of a weird way of saying, oh, this is so pleasing to me and exciting to destroy another race. It doesn't matter whether they're good or bad. I don't think that that's the heart that God has placed in us. So we need to look at other translations and see what this word actually is. Okay, let's look at destroyed. I did look it up in Blue Letter Bible, and it really didn't help because there's only one context for this word, destroying them. So I'm going to look at the OJB version, and let me read the sentence to you, and then I'm going to read the OJB. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. Thus the Yehudim, Jews, struck all their Oivim, enemies, with Makat Sharev, slaughter, destruction, and did what they would unto those who hated them. Okay, so they were given certain authority to do what they were going to do to them. The reason I think this is important is because what's happening in the Middle East is a justification that if you're a prisoner of war, or if you have come against those calling themselves Jews, though they are not, that are a synagogue of Satan. If you do anything to Israel, then it's fair game. They can do whatever they want to you. So that means that they can sodomize you. Do you think that's what God was saying here? Do what you please to them. Do whatever you want. I'll turn the other way. I won't look. I don't think so, guys. I still don't have clarity, to be honest, about the context of destroying. I mean, normally I would look at destroy and I would say, okay, that's killed. But then when I'm looking at the whole context, I'm seeing struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. So, I mean, it sounds to me like he's just using all of these different words, concepts to talk about exactly what it sounds like. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't another context. So I think it's face valid. All right, verse 6. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. See, that was where it made me really question. The Jews killed and destroyed. So maybe what God is wanting us to understand is a finality to this, that it's not just about killing, it's also about destroying this evil so that it's not able to rise again. Kind of reminds me of like when I used to watch movies and like, you know, there'd be a bad guy who like you thought they were killed and they just kept coming back to life like 20 times. Here, what I'm understanding is like there's a finality, struck down with the sword, killed, annihilated, destroyed. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Espatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Erisai, Aridai, Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. Oh, okay, this was where I was confused because this is it. So, it was all of these contexts. So you hear they killed all of these people, and then it says the 10 sons of Haman, of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But then you're going to see later that Esther requests that they be impaled on poles. What does that mean? Like, are they being flaunted on poles? Because they've already been killed. Why would you hang a dead person from a pole? But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. So the only thing that I can understand from this is she wanted to make sure that they were seen. I guess I can kind of understand like maybe her intention there for them to be seen and bring fear to their enemies. Like, this could happen to you. Here's what happened to Haman and his sons. That's the only thing I can understand from that, because you definitely can't kill them twice. So there's a reason she wanted them hanging there. I know this is graphic. I'm sorry about that, but it's important that we talk about like these kind of weird sort of passages or challenging passages to understand. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observed the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Okay, we're going to talk about what those presents are in a moment. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes near and far to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Okay, so I just want to make a point about this, about presents, okay? I've had people contact me, actually a lot of people have contacted me about, oh, you can't celebrate birthdays, you can't give presents to each other, you can't, do this and that. I would agree that in any situation, it's not appropriate to indulge or to just, kind of do what is done with worldly celebrations where people just go out and they like, the more you buy, the more blessed you are or something, or that you're just buying to buy. But there is nothing wrong with giving gifts. Gifts were brought to Jesus when Jesus was born. I mean, give me a break. This is not correct. And I've had people tell me, well, the only two people that celebrated birthdays were evil in the Bible. So evil people brush their teeth and righteous people brush their teeth. We got to make it evil because evil people do it? You can't determine that something is evil by association. The Bible has to tell you that it's evil. And if you're marking the number of years that a person has lived, like so-and-so was this age, then you must be observing birthday to a certain extent. Maybe you don't have a cake. Maybe you're not putting candles on it and saying, make a wish, because God's people don't make wishes. We don't need to wish into the air. That's a pagan practice. But as far as giving gifts to each other, you're allowed to give gifts to each other. They were giving gifts of food, probably because that was their livelihood. That's what they that's what they did. They grew food. They didn't go to Toys R Us and go pick up a bunch of toys or something. They made things. They grew things. And their gifts were probably a lot more meaningful than most of the gifts that we give. So I just want to make that point, that these extra doctrines that people are coming up with are just that. They're extra doctrines. And the word says don't add to the scroll. Not only does it say that, but it says that those who add to the scroll are accursed. It kind of reminds me of like the flogging that they do in Catholicism. Why? Because the word says to bring yourself low, to afflict yourself. It doesn't say to flog yourself. Afflict yourself with fasting. Withhold from yourself. Withhold from your flesh. You think that by harming yourself in the flesh, that's somehow pleasing to God? This is what people have been doing for thousands of years. Like when God sends a plague or something, now they're like flogging themselves in the streets and they're bleeding, like that's going to help the plague. You don't need to add extra burdens to your own back, and you don't need to add them to other people's. Go with what the word has said. There's plenty in the covenant, believe me. You're not going to run out of things. These things are distractions. It's perfectly acceptable to give one another gifts. Just don't be worldly about it. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Look at that. Like, is it not right to give gifts to the poor? Like, you see someone in need and what are you going to say? Oh, no, this was associated with Herod in the Bible, so can't give gifts to the poor. That's just dull-minded. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and cast the poor, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. Okay, so this other celebration in the word, it's not in Leviticus 23. It's not directly, I guess, commanded of you that you observe this. But if you consider yourself a Jew by circumcision in the covenant, why would you not observe this? I've also had people come on the channel and say that this is like extra. Oh, well, I have trouble with that. I have trouble with celebrating anything that's not in Leviticus 23. Well, guess what? New moon's not in Leviticus 23. And if you're not observing new moon, you're not even observing any of what's commanded in Leviticus 23 correctly, because it's all counted down from the new moon. I consider myself to be a true spiritual Jew through the covenant of circumcision. Because of that, this is one of my favorite books in the Bible. And I'm going to observe Purim along with everyone else who is considered a Jew. Because just because I wasn't there, or I'm not a direct descendant, doesn't mean anything. This story applies to me more than certain people who are direct descendants, but are not in the covenant of circumcision. This applies to me more than Jewish Zionists who are killing and stealing and sodomizing and raping. So I'm going to observe it. And if you are in the covenant of circumcision, you should too. If Jesus observed these things, why wouldn't we? Aren't we supposed to mimic him? So see, I just don't have the patience to argue with people who do this on the channel, because all they are is a distraction, and all they're doing is revealing their heart to not want to do more than they have to do. And if that's how you feel about it, we read in John, if you think that God's commands or that these observances are burdensome, how can God be in you? These commands, these observances are a joy. They have spiritual significance to our salvation. Why would you not want to observe them? Verse 25. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, P-U-R. Because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail, observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. You think God's not involved in that? You think it's just a human tradition? God's involved in that. God has established certain days that he wants us to observe in order to remember what he's done. Jews took it upon themselves to establish these 2 days of observance for what he had done for them. This is not an addition to the scroll. This is in the scroll. God included it in the scroll. It's crazy because the people saying these things are the very people who will observe pagan holidays like Christmas and Easter, but God forbid that they observe something that the Jews established to remember what God had done. What does God have to do with Christmas? Nothing. That's not even his calendar. What does he have to do with Easter? Nothing. He established Passover. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. It says it right there in the scroll, guys. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it is written down in the records. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. I hope this study has been a blessing to you. I hope it's given clarity to how we need to look at the stories of the Bible, the symbolism that God is using, and also how to turn our heart towards him. Like, what is it that he's doing? Personally, I think that, having this attitude of like, I'm only going to observe what's in Leviticus 23. I'm not going to observe this. It just reveals a person's heart. Like, you're taking this in a rule for this, rule for that kind of way. If I include myself in this group, then I want to do what this group does. This group, not the group calling themselves Jews, who reform his word and don't even obey him or acknowledge his Messiah. I want to do what this group does. So that's what I'm going to do. Now discern this with God.